right, so let me share my screen here. Oh, I would like to say anybody who's watching the webinar, if you are watching live, if you have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat and we will address them at the end of the webinar. All right. Here we go.
Oh, that looks beautiful.
Ah, look at that. Wonderful. Look at those colors. All right. All right. So I think the personal statement process, I remember doing personal statements in high school, which was too long ago for me to say when that was. But I do remember it being such a kind of monster under the bed situation where I was like, I know it's really important and I don't know what schools want from me or what I'm supposed to do here. Would either of you like to kind of chime in on where you think is the easiest place to start?
Sure. Well, there's one line from a movie, Finding Forrester, that always sticks out for me. And I always botch the Sean Connery impression, but it's just start writing. Punch those keys, get the words on the page. We're all going to say that when we're coaching our kids, right? I mean, because we feel the same hesitation. We feel like everything has to be perfect right from the get-go. So Chris, I know you were talking a lot about this. The brainstorming exercises, I think, are an awesome way to start that. And maybe you can say a little bit more about that later. But since, the basic thrust of these essays for college applications is what qualities do you want to communicate to the colleges through the stories you end up choosing in the end to tell. I like to have conversations with the family, friends or parents right off the bat to assess, how would you describe this person? What are the adjectives you would use? What are some of the themes that capture those qualities? And I think that that's kind of an inherently fun, sometimes uncomfortable exercise for the student, but fun for other people that are involved. It breaks the ice and it kind of opens things up.
Yeah, that's such an underrated exercise. This picture really hits home for me because that was me in high school. I think a lot of students these days, like as soon as I hear a personal statement, they think, okay, what story can I immediately tell that's going to make me stand out? So they're already trying to think of the end result, and they're not really taking into account how important and critical the brainstorming process really is. So that was me. I was just like, okay, all right, I know it's important, just as Kat said, but I know the admissions office, they've seen so many essays. How do I differentiate myself? And then you kind of, in a way, self-sabotage because you think, I'm not interesting enough, right? But instead of trying to start with what story should I tell, you kind of have to just take those baby steps and think organically what qualities really stand out about me, and you can ask for help.
Yeah, and I think from what you guys are saying, it's so about the process. I think we live in a society that is very like instant gratification, right? And we have to come to terms with the fact that you're not going to write, I don't know, 12th night right out the gate, right? It has to be a process of drafts, and you can have the best ideas, but if they're not down on paper, you don't have any, right? I think a lot of people say that. Being in LA, where everybody has a script idea, right? Everybody's got a great script idea, but who actually ends up writing the scripts? Actually, not that many people. So it's all about getting it down on paper, ultimately, in my view. Let's move on to the next slide.
This is me, Chris. This is when I start.
Which one? Are you looking at the screen, or
I think I'm Jeff Bridges. I'm Jeff Bridges first, and I end up being the cartoon in the lower right.
Okay.
Yes. And this brings us to, the next part, which is what Chris was talking about, that brainstorm and free write. So when you guys are talking to students, how do you bring this up? Because I think we're not used to talking about ourselves when we're at that age, or we feel like it is, it's like tooting your own horn and it's a bad thing. So how do you approach this without making people feel like it is that?
I think that it can be hard for most people to talk about themselves. You know, it's a little awkward, and you don't necessarily know yourself um, very objectively, right? And I think that one of the reasons why I like to loop family, especially parents, in if they're available for those very early conversations in the essay writing process. There's two values there, I think. The first one is you do have a person who obviously loves the student and knows the student very well and has seen them grow and develop, knows their life. And so, you know, parents aren't necessarily objective, but they do provide some of the perspective that we're trying to go for, which is, what are your best qualities? You know, how would somebody who loves you, you know, describe you if they only had 3 adjectives? That, I think, can get the ball rolling on brainstorming about qualities instead of brainstorming stories that express those qualities, which comes later. The other thing that I think is very valuable about bringing parents into that first conversation or two is to prepare parents for this process too. So I think brainstorming as a phase involves not just getting some ideas out and generating a little bit of scaffolding for where the essays are going to ultimately go, but also just preparing all parties to the entire process, how long it takes to brainstorm, what the process of actually writing drafts looks like, and then why we ultimately hone in on stories that best express qualities instead of stories that try to pinpoint like all of the highlights of the student's resume. And we can maybe talk a little bit more about this later, but I think we all have had the experience with parents who just very naturally want that final check before students press the submit button when applications are due. And they want to read over those essays one last time. And I think the natural tendency, which is, again, understandable, it's an instinct, is to get very anxious if they think students have left any highlights out. And so that's part of the brainstorming exercise in my case. I really like to really emphasize why we focus on qualities first and stories second.
That was beautifully said, Brad. For me, it obviously depends on the student. Some of these students, you know, say write a few qualities about themselves and they can do it without thinking about the story. But others, and I would say a majority of the most, like, since creative writing in general is not really a point of emphasis anymore, in addition to personal narratives, they're not used to writing about themselves. They still just freeze up so that in the previous slide, they're just looking at their screen like this. And I can relate to that personally. But that's why I really encourage my students to do the free write process. Even if you don't have any ideas, like in terms of stories and qualities, and you're just confused, I just say, just write whatever comes down to your mind. I literally had one student who was just literally like, I don't know what to do right now, right? Like, I don't know what makes me interesting. And he just let his thoughts start free flowing. And then he started coming up with actually qualities and stories that were personable to him. And you could actually surprise yourself. And that's what, you kind of almost have to tell my students, you have to make this process fun. It's already stressful. That's why to get friends and your parents involved in the process and be like, oh, why don't you just do an interview with your parents? Like, what, why am I your favorite son or daughter? Yeah, like just butter me up a little bit, just let's have fun with the process, because a lot of people want to rush to that finish line, but it's not. This is a long process. So once again, baby stepping it and just taking a deep breath, writing whatever comes to mind, just getting words on paper. Some people accidentally come across their topic, and those are the best essays that are usually produced.
Yeah, I agree. And I think another thing that is worth mentioning is the prompts for the Common App personal statements. There's sometimes a focus to really, obviously you have to answer the prompt. That's important. But the prompts are vague enough, and there's so many of them where they all can be mixed and matched with each other. So I don't think writing to the prompt is as important as, like Brad said, thinking about those qualities that you love about yourself, because a story will inevitably come up in which those qualities are utilized, and it'll match a personal statement prompt without even having to go from the prompt and work that way.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I do think, yeah, any way that you can get yourself to start writing, whether that's thinking about the qualities or even thinking about, I don't know, if you play tennis or something like that, and you've played tennis for so long, well, there's something about you that has allowed you to play tennis that long, right? Either, like it says here, you're resilient, or you're a hard worker, or, you know, you're flexible. Something like that has to come up in some of the activities in your life. There's never, seldom, but almost never, anything that can't be explained through how you view the world, right? And move through it. All right.
Oh,
Great.
the ESM way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Chris, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, so this is kind of part of the brainstorming process as well. And as Brad can attest, a lot of our counselors do this, but if you start staring at the screen and don't know where to start, here are some fill in the blanks and short answer questions to get you started. Sometimes that's all you need. You can just come up with fun prompts, fun questions that come to mind, and just start writing. It doesn't have to be focused on a specific thing, but these are just kind of, you know, starters for students to gear up and, you know, see where their mind takes them, essentially. It doesn't have to be, like I said, related to the personal statement prompt itself. You can kind of tie all these things into it eventually. But yeah, it's just to kind of get their mind going, get the juices flowing, and get comfortable with just writing in general.
Yeah, sometimes I have found that going through some of these ESM brainstorming exercises reveals little gems, little things about the student that, from the student's perspective, those are no big deal. That is never, you know, that little nugget of information or insight wouldn't be something of note. But as a counselor or as essay coaches, we know maybe there's like a little vein that we can mine there. It's interesting. You know, I don't know. I think that a really valuable part of this phase, the brainstorming phase with the ESM, is understanding what is a potentially good set of essay topics or essay topic and what might not be. My experience, and Kat and Chris, I'm sure you guys could comment on this as well, is part of the heavy lifting in the beginning is getting students to understand that even seemingly very trivial, mundane bits and pieces of their personality or their experience or their life can be very beautiful or hilarious or moving, you know, stories, ultimately, depending on where you take them. And these exercises can reveal, you know, like the tip of the iceberg sometimes of those stories. We can help the student maybe recognize through asking these questions.
Yeah, and I like to use, I think movies and TV really exhibit this beautifully, where they'll take a mundane situation, like The Office, for example, right? There's nothing special about that place, but they made 10 seasons out of that. And so I think it's important to remember that what you might not feel is important is something that could be something really worthwhile. A good example that I have of a real essay that a student ended up writing was, he liked to cook, and it was very cultural for him to cook. And it was just something that he did every day with his mom, because that's what they did in their household. And we really zoomed in on the moment where he's washing rice, which takes a lot of patience. You have to do it a bunch to just get the water to become clear. And there was something in that moment that I thought was really special and that he should expand on. And it ended up being his whole essay, which I thought was really interesting. Something that is like, who would think to write about that ultimately became a really unique thing. And Chris, as you were saying, kids really worry about, of course, sticking out to colleges. How can I be special? And I think being special, this is going to sound like, I don't know, kind of a lame ism, but it's just being you, right? If you're coming at it from an activities perspective of, I'm class president or I'm captain of the football team, those are great, but there are a lot of other kids who have those experiences as well. So if you can take take a snapshot of a moment from your life that they can't see on your resume, I think that that's the most important thing to put out there.
Exactly. If it's listed on your activities list already, or your personal statement, we'll get into the things to avoid later on, but you don't want it to sound like a resume or like you're just listing off things. You want it to be as personable as possible. You want it to be as authentic as possible. And people think like, well, as you said, your example, washing rice, right? No one's going to think that's, oh, wow, what a great, like, how does that compare to somebody like, traveling the world and, helping out on some internship and building houses? But you'd be surprised, admissions officers have seen it all. So they want to see you reflected in your personal statement. It's not so much about the event and story, but what qualities you actually relay in the actual essay itself.
Yeah.
That's a great point, Chris. There's this image that I like to use where imagine that the admissions officers reading your essay are like a person at a very crowded party full of really high achievers. And just like you might be after meeting 100 or 1,000 people who relate stories of just coming back from abroad, building shelters, or having patented their first, line of code at age 8, or whatever it is. And then they encounter somebody who just has this very down to earth story, who's very authentic, very relatable. When they leave that party at the end of the night, they might just remember the person who is very real, who established that, basic human connection, who came off very authentic and to whom they could relate. And I think that's kind of what we're all touching on. That's something that I like to keep in mind.
Yeah. And I think that's the key word, actually, if you could summarize all of this, is authenticity. Admissions officers can spot from a mile away at this point what is authentic and what is, kind of this false image that you're trying to portray because you think that's what they want. So ultimately, authenticity is going to win in this situation. Here's some more examples.
Examples.
Yeah, great examples. And I think something that I wanted to point out was we're always trying to portray ourselves in the best light. What are my strengths? What am I good at? How was I great in this situation? Sometimes something that's equally as arresting and maybe even more interesting is when there was a failure of some kind, or you learned a lesson from making some sort of mistake, because that shows not only that you're human, because we all make those mistakes, but that you're willing to learn from those mistakes, right? Which, if you think about it, why wouldn't a college want a student like that at their school, ultimately?
Beautifully said.
Thank you.
You'd be surprised how well you can stand out when you have an authentic essay.
Yep.
And if you play your strengths, if you play your authentic strengths in particular. So if you're a funny person, you can be funny in your essay. Just do you, make people laugh. If you're a nostalgic person or a sensitive person, maybe you'll make them cry, but it has to be real and it has to be you.
Be your authentic self. Do not try to impress them by listing things, or they can, like I said, or actually what Kat was alluding to earlier, they can tell when you're trying to smooth them, they've seen it all.
Mm-hmm.
So.
All right, now we're getting to kind of the brass tacks of the personal statement, which we were all talking about. But here are some more technical things to keep in mind as you're writing. Writing it in your own voice. Again, that's what Brad was just saying. If you're somebody who likes to use humor, or if you're somebody who's really sensitive or nostalgic or is very descriptive, absolutely play to those strengths. Again, don't try to make it overly serious if that's really not how you go about life. Show, don't tell is very important. There is a need when you write, I think for all of us, to write a lot of exposition, to explain a lot of things, because we think we have to explain things. But, and I'll go back to movies because I love them. When you're watching a movie, I mean, sometimes they have narration, but a lot of times when you start a movie out, it's just visual, right? You're just seeing things, and that's the context that we need. And that's all the context that we need. If you over-explain, you're wasting your word count, which does happen. And you're kind of building up to something instead of starting out right out of the gate really, really strong and hooking them. Brad, do you want to take the next one?
Yeah, I think that to your earlier point, Kat, there's a wide array of qualities that you might want to showcase through specific stories. And let's just say, for example, that one quality you want to showcase is your resilience, or your strength, your ability to overcome obstacles. That's great. Recovering, that's a fantastic, strength. But I think using a positive tone, the best way to think about that is college admissions readers are looking for people who they want on their team, right? They want you, they're seeing if they want you, they want to have you join their community. So generally speaking, using a positive tone, an uplifting tone, a tone of empowerment will help you be someone who they think will add a lot to their community, will add a lot to their team. And so it's a very important just to keep that frame in mind, that you are not a victim. You really want to avoid coming off as though there's not any redemption for you or for the other people in your life that may be involved in the story you try to tell. So you're really going to bring value to whatever community you join.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so important. I mean, life is hard. Horrible things happen or difficult things happen. But again, if they're going to have you for the next 4 years, they want to know how you're going to rise above that. So that if one of those situations arises in school, how will you face that challenge? Step to that. Chris, can you take the active voice note?
Yeah, absolutely. And this goes back to bringing in the reader into the moment that you're trying to express. It goes back to actually the show don't tell, writing in your own voice. It all linked together, but you want them to feel what you're feeling, right? You could easily explain it away. Oh, I was sad, but oh, I bounced back, and da da da. Like, okay, but how did you feel in that specific moment? And I just think back to a lot of my former student essays. Like, let's see, I don't want to put one of them on blast, but one of them had a failure, right? And he took me back to when he was just sitting in his room, just staring at the wall, and he put that record player on, was in his feels, but the way he described it, I was there with him, right? So there's one thing to just say that you were depressed and let it be. There's another to make the reader feel in that moment with you. So to do that, you use the active voice, and that's where it gets really intimate. And that's another word that I use for my students, that I want, make it an intimate situation. And that's how you pretty much become authentic.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I love that word intimate. I think it's so important, because showing vulnerability is the way that people are let into your life, right? And that goes the same for a personal statement. If you're trying to present something shiny or you're glossing over things, they're not getting the full picture, and they're probably not going to be that interested or invested. So you want them to kind of buy into what you're writing. And a little bit more technical, but again, you can play with tenses, right? Present tense is a way to really bring people in, even if the event happened in the past. Bringing us into that moment and speaking of it as if it's still happening is a really solid, powerful way to do that.
Yeah, flashback points.
Yeah.
Very, very big.
Exactly.
Powerful to start with as well. If any
Absolutely.
students are listening to this.
Yeah. And messing with chronology, right? Of like starting out with something that already happened and then coming to the present, maybe going back. There's all sorts of different ways you can do it. There's no, you're probably used to writing, your 5-paragraph essay in school. This is not that. It doesn't have to be that. It can be if that's the way it shakes out, but there are a lot of different ways to write this statement. So allow yourself the freedom to play with that, because it's really a creative piece ultimately. And structure can point to that creativity a lot. I'm so scared of that GIF of Jack Nicholson. I've just been
who would even put that on there?
eye contact with him.
Wasn't me.
Yeah, wasn't me either. All right, now we are getting We're getting to the part of the conversation that is just, warnings of things that we want to watch out for or avoid as you're writing this personal statement or crafting it. Because what you don't want to do is just barrel through and not think about the potential implications of the way that you write or what you're writing about. Come to, a few days before you submit. And if you get feedback from English teacher or somebody else and they read it and they're like, here's this, there needs to be an overhaul. You never want to be in the position where you have to overhaul your personal statement very close to the deadline. That is just not a good situation. So we're going to talk a little bit about things that you can prevent easily in the process so that you don't come to that point. Some things that you probably already know from your English class, right? Avoiding cliches. It's not about being special and trying to find something that's like totally unique, because yes, every person is unique, but avoiding cliches, like I can't even think of a good cliche right now that would work.
It was a dark and stormy night. Don't start your essay that way.
Thank you. Yeah.
You want to be authentic, don't avoid cliches.
Yeah, agreed. Redundancy happens a lot in essays. I find that as I'm editing, people, again, the way they feel the need to be very expository, they feel the need to repeat, as if repeating it is emphasizing it. But if you said it, trust that the reader knows that you said it, acknowledges it, and that you can move on and use your word count elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Brad, inappropriate language?
Don't use it. It's just never a good idea. You can always figure out a different way to describe something shocking if that's what you're going for, or being personable or funny if that's what you're going for. It's just not worth the risk.
Agreed.
And hyperboles are, I'm sorry, Chris, hyperboles are extremely fascinatingly overused.
Yes.
But I think you could do an exceedingly better job than I could at explaining why they are superfluously to be avoided.
Nice.
Edit me.
Yeah.
That was beautiful. That was good. That was good. This goes back kind of to the show don't tell part. Like everyone wants to use extremely and just all the great examples that you just put. And it's just like, don't, like, for me personally, like when I'm going through an essay and I see a lot of adverbs specifically, I'm just like, don't, like, it's almost like a cover up for the show don't tell. Like, just take the snapshot of what you're trying to do and then just write it out as it's playing out in, like you said, present tense, playing out in your head. But I feel like it kind of undercuts a lot of somebody's actual story. Oh, I was extremely devastated. And then they stop there. And you're just like, okay, well.
One adverb that I
what
find
else?
makes its way in a lot is genuinely. I was genuinely excited. I was genuinely sad. Well, the reader is assuming already that whatever feeling you had was genuine, right? So genuinely overqualifies something that we already know. So would you just
honestly, Kat, that's a great point.
Literally?
It's literally a fantastic
Stay away
point.
from literally, yeah. Unless it's really literal. But
I
again,
think the next, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just about to say, yeah, I think that the next one is a little bit harder, just to sort of say, like, don't do this, don't do this. Making someone else the highlight sneaks into a lot of my students' writing. And I don't know if either of you have experienced this as well. I think it's a little bit hard to find a balance and make the story really about you and your experience. And what have you guys seen for effective ways to help students not feel like they're being self-important, but also make sure that they understand we're not telling stories about other people here, or what happened to other people, or what other people experienced?
I think there's a mutuality that needs to exist in an essay where you're writing about somebody else. In other words, if it's how they're amazing, or taught you something, how did you also teach them something, right? Or using them as an example rather than the focus. I know that's a fine line, but I think if it reads like a biography of another amazing person, that's great, but like they're not applying to college.
Hmm.
So that's what I'll always say is that this seems like an essay about your sister. You're applying. So I think it is a way for people to avoid talking about themselves, honestly. Honestly. Oh,
Oh, look who did it.
yeah.
Oh,
It's
come
a way
on.
for
Yeah.
people to avoid the discomfort of having to talk about themselves, but that's what this is for. So at a certain point, we just have to accept that.
This is very, very difficult, especially when they're, talking about incidents where someone's like a huge role model for them or has inspired them in some way. And have played like a major role in changing who they are. So I always tell my students, talk about the effect more than the cause. So hone in on
That's a great
that
way to put it.
first. Yes. Hone in on that first. Obviously mention them or whatever, but focus on how you personally changed or were inspired versus making them the highlight. Because like I said, we're actually used to writing about other people more so than about ourselves. Goes back to personal narratives not being a big thing in high school anymore, to be honest.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Great. And the last one, do not list. Again, it's the over explaining, right? Over listing, talking about, instead of focusing on one aspect of you, trying to shove everything about you or everything that you've ever accomplished into one essay. And you just don't have the time for it. Again, they can see your extracurricular list. They don't need the list. They need a little snapshot of one of those instances, or maybe even one that is not on that list, right? And so really resist that urge, because it's such a waste of like the moment you get to really let somebody in to your life. So just don't do it.
As Michael says, don't do it.
Don't do it.
But we will tell you verbally. So
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think, so here's some more technical things. And this is a really good, if you're thinking about it as a whole and what you need to do to get started, I think this is a really important thing. As a person who really likes to have paper and not computer stuff, I sound like I'm a million years old. I have trouble organizing anything that is like on a computer. Like I'll create a draft of something and then it'll be in the computer, obviously, but I'll just assume it's in there and not really like deal with it. But then when you're trying to search for something or find something, either in your Google Drive or on your computer, it can be very frustrating. So it's really important that you have everything in one spot. There is also a history. If you write something in Google Docs and you edit it, you can actually go back and look at the history of what it was before what you edited. So don't worry so much about like keeping the old draft. But that's a really good tool that you can use to see where you've come from, if there's anything you want to change back, etc. And once the supplements start to roll in, which we're not talking about in this webinar specifically, but once the supplements roll in, you really need to have that organization, because every school has a different set of supplements. And you do not want to mix those up. You do not want to submit the wrong supplement to the wrong school. Yeah, so that's cautionary tale.
And a note on the supplements and like the UCSAs, all that, which will probably be in a different webinar. Those brainstorming exercises that we talked about in the beginning, keep them in this document as well, because you can use those to refer to for topics for those as well. So like I said, it might, you're not going to, when you brainstorm, not going to use them all for your personal statement. So you can keep them and save them, which kind of brings us to number 2, map out a timeline. I know ESM counselors, Brad, are great with this, but like I said, make sure you're not procrastinating, giving yourself ample time to where you're not rushing through things. Very important. And I think speaks for itself.
Yeah, and I think, it's one of those things where you feel like you have all the time in the world to write a personal statement. In other words, like you get out for the summer and you're like, I got the full summer. Or yeah, I've got till November 1st. That all sounds really nice and far away, but you're forgetting that maybe you're doing a summer activity, maybe you have a summer job, maybe you are taking a summer class. So the summer is already filled up. And then going into the school year, forget about it, right? So in terms of timing, Brad, maybe you can speak to this since you're a counselor, but you don't have to get super granular, but what do you recommend in terms of having this done by this time? If we're thinking like summer, fall, that type of thing.
Yeah, I think that the ideal time to finish your personal statement is over the summer. I don't think you should be writing your personal statement after classes start in the fall for rising seniors. There's too many other things to do. You're too fixated on your classes, sports, getting back into school, in particular this coming fall. That's going to be just the floodgates of socializing with friends again and being back in the swing of things, we hope again, is going to be very distracting. And, personal statement writing and all other essays for that matter, are inherently contemplative, slow exercises. And the ability to do that over the summer, I tell most of my clients, I'm kind of part secretary and drill sergeant. Like, big part of my job is to remind you week after week, this is how close we are to, class is starting up again. And this is how much, little time you'll have once that starts to do this work. So I think it's definitely appropriate to plan to finish final draft, polished, ready for personal statements, essentially by the end of August. And then if there's a little bit left over rolling into September, that's okay. But this is not a fall activity. This is a summer activity.
Absolutely. And, like I said, those supplements, there's a ton of them.
They sneak up on students
Every year. And, you can warn people so much. And then
Mhm.
when they experience it, they're like, oh, this is a lot.
We've had many students actually completely change their college list because the supplements snuck up on them and they didn't know ahead of time. Now, anybody we're working with, probably that's not going to happen because we're looking ahead. We're making sure we have those prompts organized in these Google Docs. So that's a big part of how we organize workflow, but it happens all the time for people who aren't as plugged in and looking ahead.
Students, if you are listening to this, I was one of those students in high school. Okay. As someone who's a writer too, I was a fool of myself. I wish I had a Brad, because guess what? I changed my whole entire college list because I was just like, I can bust these essays out just like that. You could bust them out, but it doesn't mean they're going to be good if you're rushing through them. All right. So that's why we're here to help you. And that's why adhering to the timeline is so important. So, and Brad, I wish I was born in a different time.
Well, there's a universe out there where we're
probably
working together.
Yeah.
Probably like 10. It's probably 10 colleges I didn't apply to because I just didn't have the time. And guess what? Your teachers do not care like that. Oh, I'm sorry, I have supplemental essays to do. That's not their priority. Some will be nice, but most of them aren't. We know that already.
And there's all the paperwork of these applications too, right? Where you have to get, recommendations. You got to talk to your counselor. You got to get your, what's it called? Transcript sent in. There's so much little stuff that you think. For some reason, this reminds me of like getting ready for a wedding, because I've been a bridesmaid like 6 times, where everything's like totally fine and it's like the night before, and then something is always missing, right? There's some element that you haven't thought of, or something that didn't arrive on time, and now we're in a bad situation. And you don't want to be in that place. Our goal is always for our students to make it as painless as possible. It is a hard process. We acknowledge that, but there are ways in which you can prevent a lot of this stuff. Brainstorming with the inside out mentality, we've already talked about that at length, but basically, making sure that you're not leaning too heavily on the resume that you have, and talking more about who you are. And then asking for help. I mean, this is a very general note here, but how do you guys see that manifesting for a student as they're in this process?
One thing that I would say is, and Kat, you're very good, I think, at emphasizing this with your students, but there's a point at which more help is counterproductive. So definitely ask for help and decide early. Who do you want to help you brainstorm? Who do you want to help read your work? You want there to be a handful of people involved. Once you get beyond 3, 4, I guess, maybe readers of your work, commenters, editors, that becomes counterproductive because everybody's going to have an opinion. You're going to spread yourself very thin. And I think that leads to sort of schizophrenic writing.
Very
Yeah,
much so.
and you're not there to please the people around you. You're there to please the admissions officers, right? And I think we can lose sight of that because especially, you know, I think parents, if you care, you can get really invested in this process, but there's a fine line between, you know, checking work or offering suggestions and trying to rewrite a student's essay because you feel, you know better. And that can really undermine the confidence of the student too, which is can have a ripple effect in so many ways. And I've seen that happen and it's really unfortunate. So I think, you know, if you have a student and you're a parent, offering help, making sure that they know that you're there, but not overextending yourself and becoming essay editor. Because I think once those worlds collide, it can be really, really hard for both parties. You know.
Exactly. That's why I think, you know, asking for help, especially during the early stages, as Brad was talking about during the brainstorming process, that's when you can really shine and do the most of your help. If you're talking about a week out and then you read it and you're like, oh, I don't like this, or I don't like the topic. You're just like, what? Your student becomes flustered, changing everything, and then they don't feel, you know, great about their essay anymore, or it's not them speaking. It's more of what you want to convey. That's where it gets tricky. So that's why you got to, you know, get those boundaries out early for both parties, so both of you aren't stressed out when those deadlines come.
Absolutely. And I think something that is really helpful, because I think procrastination, because of the need to be perfect, is just runs rampant, especially nowadays. And kids will put something off because it is just, you want it to be perfect and it's never going to come out perfect. So asking for help a lot, I think, for me, consists of having somebody holding you accountable to the timeline that you set for yourself. If you're not good at holding yourself accountable for that, or that's something that you struggle with, I highly suggest maybe grabbing a friend and saying, hey, let's hold each other accountable. Let's map out a schedule for what we want to have done by the end of the summer. I'll check in on you, you check in on me, and make sure that we're both working at the pace that we set out to have. And that can make it more fun. Yeah, it can make it more fun too, right? Like if you guys know you're all in it together, it makes it a little less painful, you know. As a writer myself, sometimes I'll get on Zoom with a friend, and it's not because we're exchanging ideas. It's because I need somebody to sit online with me while I write. And so we'll just have these silent writing sessions over Zoom where neither of us is talking, but we're at least really focused in on the moment. Yeah.
It's a great idea.
Yeah, as a recovering procrastinator myself, I have.
I'm going to definitely suggest that with a few of my students.
Good. And that, that brings us to kind of definitely the end of this. But do you guys
have any questions?
Yeah, any questions? Don't see any. If you have any questions in the future, I'll give my email address. It's kat@esmprep.com. You can always shoot us questions there. If you guys would like to share, you can.
Sure. I'm bharris@esmprep.com.
I am cjohnson@esmprep.com.
Nice.
Love to hear from anybody.
Yeah, exactly. We're always happy to help. I think there's something so joyful about, I don't know, kids are just really proud of themselves after they write this, and they should be. It's a process, and you actually start to discover a lot about yourself along the way as you're writing about yourself, that I think is like really interesting to watch.
The before and after is amazing.
Yes.
After you've written your personal statement and all your supplements, you see whatever it is, it's just like, wow, that confidence in yourself that you can not only do it, but you feel better about the qualities that you expressed.
Yeah.
amazing to see.
Yeah, and it proves that you have it in you to do these things. And there's a lot of writing in college too. So I always say, it's not going to end with the personal statement, but now you know that you're capable of really, really good writing. And that's going to serve you probably throughout your life. So it's a good life skill.
Well put, Kat.
Yeah.
Kat, thank you for hosting this. It was great to be involved, and thanks everybody for being here.
Yeah.
Beautifully done. Beautifully done. Great host. Great host.
Oh,
Great host.
So much. Thank you guys.
Hope everybody has a wonderful week and a wonderful weekend. And you have our emails. Feel free to follow up anytime.
Yes. Take care, everybody. Thanks for attending.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.